It's funny, isn't it? The people who really make you stop and think are often the ones who seem to live in two completely different worlds.
Right.
Like, take M.R. James.
Oh, absolutely.
You've got this like towering figure in academia,
Yeah.
provost of both King's College, Cambridge, and Eton College.
The top.
Yeah, pinnacles of British scholarly life, really.
Exactly.
World-renowned expert on medieval manuscripts. And yet, this is the same guy, the same M.R. James, who gave us some of the most genuinely unsettling and enduring ghost stories ever written.
It's such a strange mix.
Yeah, it's that fascinating duality, that unexpected kind of collision of intellect and imagination that we're really going to dive deep into today.
It is a compelling contrast, and I think we've got some great resources to help us unpack it all. So we're going to be looking at the Wikipedia entry for M.R. James for a good overview.
Solid foundation.
Yeah. And we'll be drawing on transcripts from two really insightful documentaries. So we've got the BBC's M.R. James Ghostwriter from Culture Vulture Rises, and Chris Hulton's The Haunting of M.R. James from Haunted Earth TV.
Excellent.
Together, they offer a really nicely rounded perspective on the man behind all these macabre tales.
Absolutely. And just to be clear, we're not just aiming to sort of tick off biographical details here.
No.
We really want to get under the skin of M.R. James. We want to understand what he went through, those life experiences, and the kind of intellectual currents that shaped him, really, and understand how that led to his unique and pretty chilling contributions to the ghost story genre. We kind of want to answer the why behind those wonderfully unsettling stories.
I think that's the most interesting part, really.
Yeah. So where do we even begin to unravel this fascinating life?
Well, I think a chronological journey is probably the most sensible way to go about it.
The beginning, then.
Yeah. Montague Rose James was born in 1862 in Goodnestone, Kent. But his family moved to Great Livermere in Suffolk when he was just 3 years old.
3 years.
And it seems that those really formative years in that rectory really laid a pretty deep foundation for everything that was to come.
It's so intriguing about Great Livermere, isn't it? Because that very same rectory had been home to another antiquarian, Thomas Martin of Palgrave, about a century and a half earlier. It's almost as if the house itself was sort of imbued with this kind of historical gravity.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Pulling young Monty towards those very interests, echoes across time, I guess you could say.
It really does suggest a powerful influence of place.
Definitely, yeah.
I mean, we also have these great details about his family. His father, Herbert James, was an evangelical Anglican clergyman, quite strict, I think. And his mother, Mary Emily, was the daughter of a naval officer.
Okay.
And he wasn't an only child. He was one of four, part of a larger family. He had two older brothers, Sidney and Herbert, and an older sister, Grace.
And that rural Suffolk setting really does seem absolutely key, doesn't it?
I think so, yeah.
The Culture Vulture Rises documentary sort of paints a picture of this place that feels somewhat, removed from like the pulse of modern life even back then. And apparently Monty's father had encountered this congregation, deeply rooted in what he termed esoteric superstition.
Huh.
People often preferred the local, wise woman or man to like traditional religious guidance.
Interesting.
So that kind of atmosphere, that sense of hidden beliefs just bubbling beneath the surface of everyday life, you can imagine how profoundly that would have impacted a young and, well, impressionable mind.
I can see that. It's almost like a folk horror setting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Before folk horror.
It is, yeah. And then you've got his formal education. So that began at Temple Grove School, followed by the, rather prestigious Eton College. And it's at Eton where he makes this rather bold claim of having translated the Book of Baruch from Ethiopic.
From Ethiopic, wow.
Whether that's entirely accurate is perhaps debatable. But it certainly reveals a pretty, remarkable intellect and a fascination with the obscure and the ancient from a very early age.
A recurring theme, definitely.
Definitely, yeah. And then Eden clearly played a really significant role, in nurturing that inherent interest he had in the past, those less well-trodden paths of knowledge. And of course, Cambridge University, specifically King's College, really became a central anchor in his life. His connection with King's was incredibly deep and long-lasting, He went from undergraduate to Don to provost. He even served as the university's vice-chancellor. I mean, it's no surprise then that the academic settings of Cambridge, with their ancient traditions, venerable buildings, these feature so prominently in many of his death stories.
Yeah, the setting is so important to his stories, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Creating that atmosphere.
Definitely.
And it's worth noting, he was apparently a pretty successful actor in student productions, too. too.
Oh, really?
So that theatrical flair, that ability to embody a character, to engage an audience, that must have contributed to his storytelling prowess, especially when he would later read his ghostly tales aloud to captivated listeners.
Yeah, storytelling's a performance, isn't it?
Absolutely. And we can't forget about his European travels, especially this one cycling Tour de France in 1884.
Okay.
The BBC documentary highlights how that very trip directly inspired his first published ghost story, Canon Alberic's scrapbook. And that's set in this incredibly atmospheric cathedral of Saint-Bertrand de Comminges. What I find so fascinating is how he weaves in such precise details, almost like guidebook-level detail into his settings,
Oh, interesting.
really grounding the supernatural in a very tangible reality.
Right. So we're seeing how his early life, his family environment, steeped in local folklore, his elite education, and his travels all kind of fed into the making of M.R. James. But he wasn't just a teller of spooky tales. He was a seriously highly regarded scholar of the medieval period. So how did that kind of, profound scholarly side of his life intertwine with those ghost stories?
This is absolutely key because while he's most famous for his ghost stories, his scholarly work, his work as a medievalist was absolutely fundamental. It's the foundation on which his fiction was built. His deep knowledge of medieval history, archaeology, and particularly manuscripts. It wasn't just a casual interest. This was his professional life.
I mean, the Wikipedia entry even mentions his discovery of the burial places of abbots at Bury St. Edmunds Abbey in 1903.
Oh, wow.
That kind of hands-on interaction with the past, unearthing these long-lost remnants, it must have been so evocative, really bringing history to life in a tangible way.
You can imagine it, can't you?
You can, yeah.
Standing there centuries later.
Exactly, yeah. And then there's this, groundbreaking work cataloging medieval manuscripts at Cambridge University. It's a huge amount of work he did. I mean,
Yeah.
he meticulously documented these collections at the Fitzwilliam Museum, Peterhouse, Corpus Christi, so many other colleges. And it's not just like listing titles. He was deeply engaging with these physical artifacts of the medieval world. And what's so interesting is he was one of the first to really pay close attention to the illustrations within these manuscripts, which apparently was a pretty novel approach back then.
Really?
Yeah, the Culture Vulture Rises documentary even shows some examples. Like, you've got the Mirror of Sinners with these kind of disturbing and grotesque depictions of demons and, decaying bodies. You can absolutely see how those vivid and kind of unsettling images might have found their way into his subconscious and then influenced how he described the supernatural.
Definitely. I mean, he's drawing on this really rich well of imagery.
Yeah, absolutely. And it wasn't just about dusty texts for him, was it? This deep immersion in these ancient documents, even the disturbing illustrations, it really seems to have provided fertile ground for the imagery in his ghost stories. It's like he was unearthing not just historical facts, but also potent psychological symbols.
That's a great way to put it.
So what's fascinating here is this direct connection between his really meticulous scholarship and then his imaginative fiction. The historically accurate details that he uses, they create this really vivid backdrop for the supernatural and his ghost stories. And it comes directly from his incredibly deep, almost unmatched understanding of the medieval period. He wasn't just, inventing things out of thin air. He was drawing upon this really rich and complex tapestry of historical knowledge and this kind of visual culture. And what's important to remember is that at the time, really detailed cataloging, especially with attention to the visual elements, that wasn't always standard practice. So his meticulous approach really did set a new benchmark. And it kind of gave him this unparalleled intimacy with the medieval mind, which undoubtedly seeped into his creative work.
Absolutely, yeah.
And of course, his later role as director of the Fitzwilliam Museum further cemented his reputation as a serious scholar. And then becoming provost of Eton College was a real testament to his high standing in the academic community.
You can see the trajectory.
Yeah.
From those early interests to, reaching the top of academia.
Yeah. So we have this image of a highly respected scholar, deeply immersed in, the tangible history of the medieval world. What was it then that sparked this seemingly very serious academic to start writing these stories specifically designed to send shivers down people's spines?
Well, it actually began as a form of entertainment.
Okay.
It became a bit of a tradition. He started writing these ghost stories as a way to amuse his friends and students, kind of on Christmas Eve.
Oh, like a Christmas tradition.
Yeah, at Eton in Cambridge.
Okay.
Often these readings would happen within the gatherings of the Chit Chat Society, which was this kind of private discussion group.
Okay.
And as far as we know, the first recorded reading was in 1893. So it was a very specific and kind of intimate setting for the initial unveiling of these tales.
And it was in these kind of intimate settings that his distinctive style, what we now call the, quote, Jamesian method, really began to coalesce. So we start to see those very characteristic elements emerging. Believable, often very English settings. You've got those quiet villages, windswept seaside towns, grand but slightly decaying country estates, and of course those familiar abbeys and universities that he knew so intimately. And occasionally ancient towns in Europe, drawing directly from his own travels.
Yeah.
So this Jamesian method that we hear about, what are the core ingredients? If someone's coming to his work for the first time, what should they expect?
Okay, well, at its heart, the Jamesian method really relies on a few key elements.
Yeah.
So firstly, you've got the setting, which is usually very ordinary and recognizable, which actually makes the intrusion of the supernatural all the more unsettling.
Oh, right, yeah.
Secondly, you've got the protagonist, who's often a somewhat unassuming intellectual figure, frequently a gentleman scholar with interests very similar to James himself. Old buildings, rare books, ancient artifacts. The story typically involves the discovery of an antiquarian object, and that object then somehow opens a doorway to a supernatural menace. And finally, he's a master of building atmosphere and suspense gradually. And he does this using suggestion and implication rather than really explicit graphic horror. And the ghosts themselves are rarely benevolent. They're usually malevolent, or as he put it, odious.
He famously said, his aim was to make the reader think, quote, if I'm not very careful, something of this kind may happen to me.
It's creepy.
It's very creepy, but it's a very specific and a relatable kind of fear, isn't it? Not some grand cosmic horror, but something that could conceivably intrude upon your own, familiar existence.
Right, like it could happen to you.
Yeah, yeah.
In your world.
Exactly.
And his techniques are really effective, I think. He uses what he calls a nicely managed crescendo, so slowly ratcheting up the tension.
Yeah, he doesn't give it all away at once, does he?
No. He prefers to hint at the horrors, allow the reader's own imagination to conjure something far more terrifying than he might explicitly describe. And by grounding the bizarre in these meticulously observed mundane details, the contrast becomes even more potent, I think.
Yeah, it's effective. Yet, despite him saying all this, advocating for this kind of reticence, the Wikipedia entry points out that a number of his tales do actually contain moments of quite brutal violence, like Lost Hearts being a particularly vivid example.
Right. Yep. Yeah.
So it's a fascinating tension, isn't it? This kind of interplay between subtle suggestion and then sudden shocking imagery.
It is, and I think it speaks to the complexity of his artistic vision.
Right, yeah.
And his deep fascination with medieval folklore and the often overlooked rural landscapes of East Anglia. I think that further solidified his position as the originator of the kind of, antiquarian ghost story, and even as a significant influence on what we now call folk horror, a connection that people are still exploring and appreciating today.
Now, looking beyond his personal experiences and his scholarly pursuits, were there any key relationships or other influences that really shaped his writing and his approach to these spectral tales?
I think so. Several come to mind.
Okay.
So his close friendship with James McBride, who provided the illustrations for Ghost Stories of an Antiquary.
Okay.
That was undoubtedly very important to James.
Yeah.
The book was initially intended as a showcase for McBride's artistic talents, but his tragically early death transformed it into a kind of memorial.
Oh, wow.
And by all accounts, James was very deeply affected by his loss.
Yeah, it's interesting the documentary excerpts also highlight his profound appreciation for the works of Sheridan Le Fanu, another master of the ghost story.
Of course, yeah.
So he was clearly engaging with and learning from the established traditions of the genre. And then there's the more nuanced and often debated topic of his personal life and how that might have informed his work. Some critics and biographers have pointed to the kind of recurring tactile nature of his ghostly encounters, those unsettling hairy hands, the slimy, clinging presences, and suggested that these might have served as a kind of, veiled expression of perhaps repressed aspects of his sexuality.
Oh, right.
And the documentary even touches on this, talking about his close relationships with younger men, such as Gordon Cry, and mentions Cry's father's rather direct observation about James's personal life.
It's definitely an interesting lens, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is. This idea that these unspoken desires might find an outlet in these deeply unsettling physical interactions with the spectral. But it's important to remember that James himself never explicitly addressed these themes in his writing or personal correspondence. And we also know that he held rather traditional views on literature, expressing admiration for classic authors and then more popular contemporaries like Agatha Christie and P.G. Wodehouse, while being quite critical of modernist writers like Huxley, Strachey, and Joyce. He even supported the banning of Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness, which was a novel exploring lesbian identity.
Really?
Yeah. And politically, he seems to have held quite conservative views, opposing Irish home rule and expressing a dislike for communism. It paints a fuller picture of the man, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The intellectual and social context in which he lived and worked, even if these specific views aren't overtly present in his ghost stories themselves.
Right. But they definitely help us understand, the man behind the stories a bit better.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And they provide a valuable context, I think, revealing a traditionalist sensibility that perhaps also contributed to those underlying anxieties that kind of subtly permeate his tales of this seemingly ordered world being disrupted by something ancient and malevolent.
So how are his ghost stories received both by his contemporaries and then, subsequent generations of readers and writers? Because it seems that he garnered a pretty significant following and a lasting influence.
He really did.
Yeah.
And he was highly admired by many within, the horror and fantasy genres. So H.P. Lovecraft, a master of cosmic horror himself, considered James to be the absolute master of the ghost story.
Wow. High praise.
And Clark Ashton Smith was another devoted admirer. Michael Sadler famously declared him the best ghost story writer England has ever produced. And even writers not typically associated with the genre, like Paul Theroux, have spoken of the profound and lasting fear his stories evoke.
That is incredibly high praise from such diverse literary figures.
It really is.
And his impact on later generations of writers is pretty undeniable. I mean, the Wikipedia entry provides a substantial list of authors who were directly inspired by his work. So from his immediate successors like H. Russell Wakefield and A.N.L. Munby, sometimes referred to as the James Gang, all the way to, contemporary masters of suspense and horror like Stephen King and Ramsey Campbell.
It's amazing, isn't it? The reach he had.
It's fascinating to kind of trace that literary lineage.
It is. And, his stories have been adapted countless times for radio, television, and film. Probably most famously through the BBC's annual A Ghost Story for Christmas series, which continues to introduce his uniquely unsettling brand of horror to new audiences.
Keeps those stories alive.
It does. And his enduring appeal, as many critics have noted, lies in his masterful ability to create a kind of pleasing terror by expertly blending his deep scholarship, his evocative and atmospheric settings, and that wonderfully subtle and suggestive approach to the supernatural.
So finally, let's get to the enigma of James's own beliefs about the supernatural. Did this meticulous scholar and weaver of, ghostly tales actually believe in ghosts, or was it purely a form of literary artistry for him?
It's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the enduring mystery.
Publicly, he always maintained a degree of ambiguity.
Oh.
Famously stating that he was prepared to consider evidence and accept it if it satisfies me.
Okay.
Which kind of suggests, an open intellectual stance, but it's stopped short of outright belief.
He's not giving too much away.
No.
However, the documentaries offer some intriguing glimpses into a potentially more personal engagement with the paranormal.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so the Haunted Earth TV documentary recounts his childhood dreams of ghostly figures, a possible sighting he experienced in the rectory grounds as a child, and then a later dream where he felt his bedclothes being violently pulled away, which is an experience that bears a striking resemblance to a key scene in Oh, Whistle, and I'll Come to You, My Lad.
Oh.
So, these biographical details do hint at something deeper, don't they?
I think so, yeah.
It's not just imagination.
And those anecdotal accounts, combined with, the incredibly detailed and often really visceral nature of the ghostly encounters he depicts in his fiction, it raises the possibility, doesn't it, that his understanding of fear, of the uncanny, may have stemmed from something beyond pure imagination. Maybe he was rooted in that deeply ingrained kind of esoteric superstition of his early environment. Or maybe he did possess a private sensitivity to the spectral that he largely kept to himself.
So we come full circle back to that central, fascinating duality of Montague Rhodes James, the meticulous, highly respected scholar who dedicated his life to understanding the tangible past, and the brilliant and enduring storyteller who conjured nightmares that continue to captivate and unsettle us.
Absolutely.
It's such a perfect blend, isn't it?
Yeah. And for you, the listener, who's interested in gaining knowledge quickly but thoroughly, I think exploring the life and influences of M.R. James provides a much richer and more nuanced appreciation for his remarkable work and his lasting impact on the ghost story genre.
Here's a final thought for you to consider. Given the intensely detailed and often deeply unsettling nature of his spectral creations and those intriguing, almost whispered hints within his own life story, how might M.R. James's own personal experiences, both within the world of rigorous scholarship and perhaps within those more shadowy realms of the uncanny, have blurred the lines between objective observation and, like, a subjective, even a personal encounter with the spectral? It's a fascinating question to keep in mind as you continue to explore his chilling tales.